The eastern horizon of the Byzantine world had always been unstable, not broken, but never fully secure. For centuries, the empire had absorbed wave after wave of pressure from the lands beyond Anatolia. Arabs, Persians, steppe raiders, each had tested its borders, and each had been contained, repelled, or outlasted. The Byzantine state endured not because it was stronger in any single moment, but because it understood time, logistics, and survival better than its enemies. But by the middle of the 11th century, something had changed. The threats were no longer distant incursions. They were becoming permanent. The empire that Romanos IV Diogenes inherited in 1068 was not the empire of Basil II. Its military system, once disciplined, regionally rooted, and resilient, had been hollowed out over decades of internal neglect. The thematic armies, local forces drawn from Anatolian landholders, had declined. In their place stood a fragile structure of mercenaries, Normans, Franks, Pecheneg, Turks, men loyal not to the empire, but a payment. And payment, increasingly, was uncertain. The imperial court in Constantinople had turned inward. Political intrigue replaced long-term planning. Generals were distrusted. Campaigns were avoided. And along the eastern frontier, that hesitation created a vacuum. Into that vacuum came the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were not a traditional empire. Not yet. They were mobile, decentralized, and difficult to pin down. Their power did not depend on holding cities, but on movement. Their strength was not in fortifications, but in speed, coordination, and the psychological pressure they imposed. Under Sultan Alp Arslan, their raids into Byzantine territory intensified. These were not simple border skirmishes. They were systematic. Turkish cavalry units moved through Armenia and eastern Anatolia with increasing confidence, avoiding major confrontations while eroding the empire's ability to respond. Villages were abandoned. Trade routes became unsafe. Local defenses began to collapse, not from decisive defeat, but from constant disruption. The Byzantine state faced a problem it was not structured to solve, an enemy that refused to stand still. Romanos IV understood this. Unlike many in Constantinople, he had military experience. He knew that passivity would only invite further encroachment. The empire could not negotiate from weakness, and it could not defend its eastern provinces without reasserting control. But control required presence, and presence required risk. From the beginning of his reign, Romanos committed himself to restoring the eastern frontier through direct military action. His campaigns in 1068, 1069, and 1070 were attempts to stabilize the situation, not through decisive battles, but through demonstration. He marched east. He showed force. He reoccupied key positions. But each time, the Seljuks avoided full engagement. They withdrew when necessary, reappeared when convenient, and continued their raids as soon as Byzantine forces dispersed. Romanos was fighting a campaign without a center, no capital to seize, no army to destroy, no fixed line to defend. It was a war of erosion, and the empire was losing. By 1071, Romanos made a decision that would define the fate of Byzantine Anatolia. He would force a confrontation, not a raid, not a demonstration, a battle, a decisive one. The target was a region around Lake Van, deep in eastern Anatolia, a contested zone where Byzantine authority had weakened and Seljuk activity had grown bolder. The fortified towns of Manzikert and nearby strongholds were critical to re-establishing control over the frontier. If Romanos could secure them, and more importantly, draw Alp Arslan into a pitched battle, he might achieve what years of maneuvering had failed to deliver: a clear victory, a restored border, a message that the Byzantine Empire was still capable of decisive force. But the decision carried enormous risk. To march that far east meant stretching supply lines across hostile terrain. It meant relying on coordination between units that did not always trust each other. It meant committing the core of the empire's military strength to a single campaign. There would be no easy retreat, no rapid reinforcement. If the campaign failed, the consequences would not be limited to a lost battle. They would reshape the balance of power in the entire region. Even before the army assembled, the internal divisions of the Byzantine state began to surface. Romanos was not universally supported. His claim to the throne was tied to marriage into the imperial family, not dynastic continuity. Many in the aristocracy viewed him as an outsider, necessary in crisis, but not fully legitimate. Among them was the powerful Doukas family, whose influence in Constantinople remained strong. Their loyalty to the emperor was conditional, their ambitions intact. This tension extended into the army itself. The Byzantine military of 1071 was not a unified force. It was a coalition. Regular troops from Anatolia and the Balkans formed the backbone, but they were supplemented by a wide array of mercenaries. Norman heavy cavalry under experienced commanders, Turkish auxiliaries familiar with steppe tactics, Pecheneg uses horsemen, whose allegiance was often uncertain. Each group brought its own methods, expectations, and loyalties. Commanding them required not just authority, but constant management. Romanos would have to maintain cohesion in an army that was structurally fragmented. As the army gathered and began its march eastward in the spring of 1071, the scale of the undertaking became clear. This was not a raid. It was a declaration. The Byzantine Empire was committing itself fully to the Eastern question, and in doing so, it was placing its remaining military credibility at stake. Meanwhile, Alp Arslan was not waiting. The Seljuk Sultan had been engaged elsewhere, campaigning against rivals to the south. But reports of the Byzantine advance forced a reassessment. A large imperial army moving deep into contested territory could not be ignored, but neither would it be met on Byzantine terms. Alp Arslan understood the nature of his advantage. But the result was dangerous. The Byzantine army, already complex and fragile, was now split. Communication between the two forces became uncertain. Coordination, essential for any large-scale engagement, was compromised, and crucially, Romanos no longer had full visibility over his own strength. What followed was confusion. Tarquinio's detachment would not rejoin the main army. Whether due to miscommunication, caution, or independent decision-making remains debated, but the effect was immediate. Romanos, advancing toward Manzikert, believed he still commanded a larger force than he actually did. In reality, a significant portion of his army was no longer present. At the same time, Seljuk forces were beginning to converge, not in a single mass, but in dispersed mobile units. Watching, tracking, waiting. The terrain around Manzikert offered no easy clarity. Open plains, broken by low ridges and uneven ground, stretched toward the horizon. It was a landscape suited to movement, not control. Visibility could shift with distance and elevation. Formations could appear stable from afar, then dissolve under pressure. For the Byzantines, it was unfamiliar ground. For the Seljuks, it was opportunity. As August approached, the distance between the two armies narrowed. Romanos established his camp near Manzikert, consolidating his remaining forces. Scouts reported Seljuk presence, but not their full strength. Movements were detected, but not fixed. The enemy was near, but not fully seen. Inside the Byzantine camp, tension grew. This was no longer a campaign of maneuver. It was approaching a confrontation, but the conditions were uncertain. The army was divided, the chain of command was strained, and the enemy refused to behave predictably. Romanos faced a narrowing set of choices: withdraw and concede the initiative, advance and risk engagement under incomplete information, or hold position and allow the Seljuks to dictate the terms of battle. He chose to engage, not recklessly, but decisively, because at this point, hesitation carried its own danger. Every day spent waiting allowed the Seljuks to gather strength. Every delay increased the strain on supplies and morale. The longer the Byzantines remained in this exposed position, the more vulnerable they became. And so, in the final days before battle, both sides prepared not for a clash of empires in the traditional sense, but for something more unstable, a confrontation shaped by movement, misjudgment, and the limits of control. The Byzantines believed they were approaching a decisive battle. The Seljuks intended to create something else, a battlefield that would not hold, a fight that would not stabilize, a situation that, once entered, would not easily be escaped. The Byzantine army, though still formidable in appearance, was no longer the cohesive force it had been when it left Constantinople. Its composition reflected the empire's structural weaknesses. At its center stood the professional corps, Byzantine infantry, disciplined and equipped for close-order fighting, supported by heavy cavalry units trained to deliver decisive shock. These troops formed the backbone of any conventional engagement. If the battle stabilized, if lines formed and held, they could still deliver overwhelming force. But stability was no longer guaranteed. Around this core were layers of uncertainty. Norman mercenaries, aggressive, heavily armed cavalry, capable of devastating charges, but not always reliable in prolonged coordination. Pecheneg uses horsemen, skilled riders, but culturally and tactically closer to the Seljuks than to the Byzantines. Turkish auxiliaries, whose loyalties could not be fully assumed. Each contingent added strength. Each also introduced risk. Command structure reflected this complexity. Romanos retained overall control, but the army was divided into traditional wings, left, center, and right, each under separate commanders. Coordination between them depended not only on signals and planning, but on trust, and trust was limited. Among the most critical figures was Andronikos Doukas, commanding the reserve forces. He represented not just a military role, but a political presence, connected to a powerful faction in Constantinople that had never fully accepted Romanos' authority. His position behind the main line gave him influence over the outcome of any engagement, but it also placed him at a distance from immediate danger. Facing them, Alp Arslan commanded a fundamentally different kind of army. Seljuk forces did not rely on rigid formations. They moved as a network. Light cavalry dominated their ranks. Horse archers capable of firing accurately while in motion, trained to operate in dispersed formations that could expand, contract, and redirect with speed. Their effectiveness did not depend on holding ground, but on controlling tempo. They would not meet the Byzantine army head-on. They would shape it. Alp Arslan's objective was not to defeat the Byzantines in a single collision. It was to dismantle their cohesion. On the morning of August 26, 1071, the two armies finally came into full view of each other. The Byzantine army formed for battle. Romanos placed his strongest units at the center, where he intended to drive forward and force engagement. Infantry advanced in formation, shields aligned, supported by heavy cavalry positioned to exploit any breakthrough. The wings extended outward, designed to prevent envelopment. The reserve remained behind. It was a traditional deployment, structured, controlled, predictable. The Seljuk army did not mirror this formation. Instead, they spread across the field in loose, shifting lines. Their presence was not defined by a single front, but by movement. Clusters of cavalry appearing, withdrawing, reappearing at different angles. They began the battle without committing. At first, the engagement was distant. Arrows, probing attacks. Small groups of Seljuk horse archers rode forward, released volleys, then turned away before contact could be made. The Byzantines advanced in response, maintaining formation, absorbing the harassment. Romanos did not order an immediate charge. He advanced steadily, deliberately. He needed contact, but contact did not come. As the Byzantine line moved forward, the Seljuks withdrew, not in retreat, but in control. They gave ground slowly, drawing the Byzantine army further from its initial position. The distance between units began to stretch. Dust rose from the movement of thousands of men and horses, reducing visibility. Signals became harder to interpret. The The field began to lose clarity. To the soldiers in the ranks, the battle did not feel like a clash. It felt like pursuit. An enemy always just out of reach. Arrows continued to fall. Irregular, persistent, difficult to respond to. Shields absorbed some. Others found gaps. Horses became restless. Units began to drift slightly as they adjusted to the movement ahead. Still, the formation held, but it was under strain. Romanos pressed forward. He could not allow the Seljuks to dictate the entire engagement. If the army stopped, the harassment would continue indefinitely. If it advanced too quickly, cohesion might break. So he maintained pressure, measured, but constant. By midday, the Byzantine army had moved significantly from its original position. The distance to the camp had increased. The terrain, subtly uneven, had begun to affect alignment between units. The wings, extended to prevent encirclement, were now operating with reduced coordination. Communication between them and the center required time. And time, in this kind of battle, created vulnerability. The Seljuks began to tighten their pattern. Their movements became more focused. Instead of wide, dispersed harassment, they concentrated pressure on specific points, testing the flanks, probing for weakness, increasing the intensity of their arrow fire. Still, they avoided direct engagement. They were waiting. Inside the Byzantine formation, fatigue began to accumulate, not from close combat, but from tension, from constant readiness, from the inability to strike back effectively. The army was advancing, but not winning. Romanos now faced a growing problem. He had not achieved the decisive engagement he needed, and the longer the battle continued in this form, the more it favored the Seljuks. By late afternoon, the situation had shifted. The Byzantine army was extended. Its cohesion, while not broken, was increasingly fragile. Visibility across the field had deteriorated, and the enemy, still not fully committed, remained fluid. At this point, Romanos made a critical decision. He ordered a controlled withdrawal. The intention was not retreat. It was reformation. The army would pull back to its original position, reestablish cohesion, and prepare for renewed engagement under more favorable conditions. But executing a withdrawal under pressure required precision, and the Byzantine army, in its current state, no longer had margin for error. The order to withdraw began to move through the ranks, but not evenly. Signals were misinterpreted. Some units began to pull back. Others continued advancing. The wings, already stretched, reacted at different speeds. Gaps began to form. The Seljuks saw it immediately. What had been a controlled engagement shifted. The pattern changed. Instead of withdrawing in parallel, the Byzantine line began to bend. Segments lost alignment. And in that moment, brief but decisive, the Seljuks committed. Their cavalry surged forward, not as a single charge, but in coordinated waves. They targeted the gaps. They increased the volume of arrow fire. They closed distance rapidly, forcing localized engagements that disrupted the already fragile structure of the Byzantine line. Confusion spread. Orders became unclear. Units that believed they were retreating in coordination found themselves isolated. Others, still advancing, suddenly faced pressure from multiple directions. The distinction between movement and collapse began to blur. Romanos attempted to stabilize the situation. From the center, he pushed to maintain order, reforming lines, directing units to hold, to regroup, to resist the encroaching pressure. But the army was no longer responding as a single entity. It was fragmenting. On the flanks, the situation deteriorated further. Seljuk cavalry exploited the openings, moving around the edges of the Byzantine formation. Arrows fell from multiple angles. Cavalry units that attempted a countercharge found no fixed target, only shifting groups that withdrew before contact. Momentum was gone, and then, at the most critical moment, the reserve did not move forward. Andronikos Doukas, positioned with the rear forces, made a decision that would define the battle. Instead of reinforcing the collapsing line, he withdrew. Whether this was misinterpretation, caution, or deliberate political calculation remains uncertain, but its effect was immediate. The reserve, intended as a stabilizing force, was gone. From the perspective of the soldiers still engaged, the meaning was clear. Support was not coming. The Byzantine army, already under pressure, now lost its final layer of cohesion. What had been a difficult withdrawal became a collapse. Units began to break. Not all at once, but in sequence. One segment gave way, then another, and as each gap widened, the Seljuks moved through it. The battlefield no longer had a front line. It had fragments. Romanos remained with the center, attempting to hold what could still be held. But the structure of the army, the system that allowed it to function, was gone. The battle had not been decided by a single charge or a single mistake. It had unraveled, piece by piece. And now, as the sun began to lower over the plains of Manzikert, the Byzantine army was no longer fighting as an army. It was fighting as isolated groups, surrounded, disoriented, and increasingly aware that the field they stood on no longer offered a way out. The Seljuks had not broken the Byzantine line in the traditional sense. They had transformed it into something unstable, something that could not hold. And once that transformation was complete, the outcome was no longer in question. By the time the sun began to fall behind the uneven horizon, the structure of the Byzantine army had ceased to exist. What remained was not a line, not even a formation, but a scattering of resistance, pockets of men, still disciplined, still fighting, but no longer connected to a larger system. Orders no longer moved across the field. Signals had lost meaning. The language of command, so essential to Byzantine warfare, had broken down under the pressure of fragmentation, and in its place there was only reaction. At the center, Romanos IV Diogenes continued to resist. He had not fled. He had not withdrawn with the reserve. He remained where the army had begun to come apart, surrounded by what remained of his core troops, attempting to stabilize something that could no longer be stabilized. For a time, that resistance held. The Imperial Guard and the remaining heavy infantry formed a defensive cluster, shields locked, maintaining a perimeter against repeated attacks. Seljuk cavalry approached, released volleys, then withdrew again, testing, probing, avoiding unnecessary losses. They did not need to rush. The outcome was already unfolding. What made the situation irreversible was not simply the loss of formation. It was the loss of orientation. The Byzantine soldiers no longer knew where the battle line was. They no longer knew where their own units ended and the enemy began. Dust, movement, noise, these had reduced the battlefield to fragments of perception. A soldier could fight effectively against what he could see. But here, visibility shifted constantly. Threats appeared from angles that had previously been secure. The mind, under these conditions, began to narrow, focus reduced to immediate survival. And with that, coordination disappeared. What had once been a controlled frontier became a contested interior. What had once been a system of defense became a struggle for survival. And the nature of warfare itself had shifted. The empire had faced an enemy that refused to fight on its terms and had been drawn into a battle it could not stabilize. In the end, the defeat at Manzikert was not the result of a single failure. It was a convergence of pressures, a fragmented army, a divided leadership, an adaptive enemy, and a battlefield that did not reward structure. The Byzantines had entered the field expecting a decisive engagement, a battle that could restore order, reassert control, define the frontier. Instead, they encountered something else, a form of warfare that dissolved certainty, that replaced clear lines with shifting pressure, that turned movement into vulnerability. And once the army lost its ability to act as a single force, the outcome followed, not suddenly, but inevitably. The field at Manzikert did not destroy the empire in a single day, but it removed the conditions that had allowed it to endure. And from that point forward, the question was no longer how Byzantium would defend its eastern frontier, but how long it could survive without it.